Have another free event offered by the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara. My name is Kirk Gradine, and I'll be introducing our speaker. Under this year's overarching theme of Concord and community, Dr. David Fideler will be presenting on Cosmopolis, Concord and Harmony in Ancient Philosophy and Modern Science. Dr. Fideler is currently residing in Europe and is coming to us via Zoom. A few notes by way of introduction for those who may not be familiar with the Institute of World Culture. It was founded here in downtown Santa Barbara by Raghavan and Nandini Iyer in 1976 as a nonprofit educational center dedicated to serving the local and global community through seminars, forums, study groups, and now via live stream online presentations on diverse aspects of world culture. All of its activities are dedicated to the promotion of universal brotherhood and the fostering of human fellowship among all races, nations, and cultures. And please check out our website at worldculture.org. Here, anyone can sign up for our monthly newsletter and discover all the activities currently being offered and in the past have been offered by the Institute. And also there is an opportunity to make donations online if one so chooses. The Institute also has a YouTube channel titled IWC in Santa Barbara, where this presentation and other recorded events can be accessed. All of the activities of the Institute arise from or are based on its 10 aims, which are found on its website. And today's presentation is related most directly to aim number 5, which is to deepen awareness of the universality of man's spiritual striving in its rich variety of expression in the religions, philosophies, and literatures of humanity. And in particular today, the philosophy that we'll be hearing some detail about is that of Stoicism. Our speaker today, as mentioned, Dr. David Fideler, is a man of diverse teaching talents and has worked as a college professor, an editor and publisher, an educational consultant, and as the director of an educational center. He studied ancient Greek philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, holds a PhD in philosophy and intellectual history, and is the editor of the Living Ideas Journal website. He was also a contributor to the New Dictionary of the History of Ideas. And I was first introduced to the profundity and clarity of Dr. Fideler's thought and writing more than 20 years ago when I read his 9-part introduction to the Pythagorean sourcebook and library, which is a fabulous collection of original documents that point to the mysterious school and teaching of Pythagoras. And the introduction that Dr. Fideler offers there is one of the best I've seen, providing a kind of summation, a brief summation of the key features of Pythagorean thought. And I've gone back to it again and again over the years. So we're very fortunate to have Dr. Fideler here presenting today. David is also the editor and author of several scholarly books, most notably Breakfast with Seneca, a Stoic Guide to the Art of Living, which has been published in 16 languages. Praised by the New York Times as the most companionable of the new Stoic books. This volume was selected by the editors of Amazon as one of the best nonfiction books of the year. Dr. Fideler currently teaches courses on the Renaissance in Italy, and he's the founder of the Renaissance program in Florence. He has spoken at the British Institute in Florence, the International Studies Institute in Florence, and elsewhere around the world. Today, he's offered for our engagement and understanding 2 presentations. The first one is 40 minutes long, pre-recorded, and the second one is 10 minutes long. And after the first presentation, we'll have an opportunity to raise questions and have discussion with Dr. Fideler online. So I give you Dr. David Fideler.
Hi, everyone. I did pre-record these presentations because they have a lot of slides in them and it's synchronized very closely to the text. So at least this part will be flawless. And then we'll take questions when they're over. So I'll start part 1 right now and we can get into it. Hi, everyone. My name is David Fideler, and thank you for coming to this presentation on Concord and harmony in ancient philosophy. I'd like to thank the Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara for inviting me to speak in their lecture series on Concord and community. Now, this presentation is divided into 2 parts. First, we'll discuss how the idea of harmony and concord underlies the ancient idea of the Cosmopolis in Stoic philosophy. The Stoics believed that all human beings share a spark of rationality or logos, which unites people in harmony. Actually, it makes us all one human family, and it makes us all citizens of a universal cosmopolis or world city. We'll also take a look at the idea of harmony in nature and what you actually need to create a cosmopolis in the first place. After part 1 of the talk, we'll have time for questions and discussion. Then in the final part of the talk, we'll explore the ideas of harmony and community in modern science, especially in the evolution of the biosphere. And after that part, we'll also have more time for discussion. So the first part of the talk is about 40 minutes. There are a lot of images and beautiful slides. And the second part of the talk is only 10 minutes. We should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So let's now begin. The most comprehensive definition of what a cosmopolis is that I know of comes from Cicero's work on laws, where he reported on the views of the earlier Stoics. And what Cicero says is that if we look at the universe as a whole, we can see that the universe is one vast city or community common to both gods and men. And that if you're a philosopher and you have surveyed the heavens, the earth, and the seas, and studied the nature of all things, and you look at the intelligence reflected throughout all of nature, you will look at yourself as not being confined within the walls of one city or as the member of any particular community, but as a citizen of the universe, considered as a single commonwealth. Cicero also notes that there is one essential justice which cements society and one law which establishes this justice. And of course, this one essential justice, which is at work in nature and society, is for Cicero and the Stoics the logos, the principle of rationality and intelligence in human beings and in nature. So what Cicero is saying is that there are 2 different cities. One is the little city where we were born or where we happen to live now, and there is the big city, the city of the world or the city of the cosmos, the cosmopolis. And this definition of the cosmopolis was followed by the later Roman Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. The other aspect of the cosmopolis that we haven't mentioned is that the universe or the world as a whole resembles an organism, and we're all parts of that organism. And this is an idea that we'll get to shortly. But before we do, let's take a deeper look at 2 key ideas behind the idea of cosmopolis. And those ideas are cosmos and logos, which in the Greek world were terms loaded with meaning. The Greek word cosmos means beautiful order and was first applied to the universe by the philosopher Pythagoras. He was the first person to call the universe a cosmos, and it's actually the source of our modern word cosmetic. And when stating that the universe is beautiful, a beautiful order, a cosmos, Pythagoras implied that the worlds of fact and value were conjoined, because beauty is a value, and saying that the universe is beautiful is also factual. Moreover, the reason why the universe is beautiful is because of harmony, harmonia in Greek, Concord, which means fitting together. And in the classical world, beauty was seen as arising from whole-part relationships, in which the parts and the whole are harmonized together through proportional relationships. So you can start to see how this relates to Cosmopolis, because a cosmopolis is all about whole-part relationships. How do we as parts relate to the greater whole? The other idea tied up with Cosmopolis is that it is ordered by logos or reason. But there's a big problem with the term logos because it's a very multi-dimensional term and has many meanings in Greek aside from conscious rationality. For example, these are some of the multiple meanings of logos. Logos is the same as the Latin word ratio, which means reason as in rationality, but it also means geometrical proportion, like a ratio, and logos means that in Greek too. So in Greek, logos is a mathematical term, and analogia is continued geometrical proportion. Logos can mean order or pattern or perhaps relatedness. It can mean the same as the Latin word oratio, a discourse, articulation, or account. It can mean reason in terms of the cause of something or the reason behind something. And it can also mean principle or cause. In plural, logoi means principles or reasons. And finally, logos can mean intelligence, both conscious intelligence and unconscious intelligence. And while the Stoics primarily use logos in their ethical writings to refer to conscious intelligence in humans, which they believe to be unique to humans, it's obvious that the living world is permeated by intelligence and by unconscious intelligence, which the Stoics also believed. For example, if I were to cut my hand, my body knows how to heal itself. And even more remarkably, if you cut off the head of a flatworm, the flatworm knows how to grow a new head. And if you look at this ivy leaf, you'll see that while it's not conscious, it uses logos as proportion and logos as intelligence to harmoniously integrate the parts within the overall structure to distribute nutrients throughout the leaf in the most economical way, which also gives rise to beauty. As Epicharmus of Kos said, all living things are intelligent. Plants may not consciously think like we do, but they embody intelligence nonetheless. Also, our normal bodily processes embody intelligence, which our conscious minds are not aware of. For example, there is an astonishing amount of intelligence reflected in the development of an embryo, which the Stoics would identify with logos. But it's not an intelligence that originates in our conscious minds. So for an embryo to develop, it's not dependent on us thinking about it consciously with our minds. It's the intelligence of the body. It's embodied intelligence. So Plato, like the good Pythagorean he was, taught that the universe was permeated by logos and harmony. And in the Timaeus, his Pythagorean creation myth, he described the universe as resembling an organism. He said the universe is one whole of wholes and a single living creature that contains all living creatures within it. And there's no question that this kind of thinking inspired the Stoic idea of the Cosmopolis, which the Stoics developed in their own way. But there's no question that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, was very aware of these ideas because before starting his own school, Zeno spent 10 years studying at Plato's Academy in Athens. And at some point, Zeno also wrote a book entitled Pythagorean Teachings, which is now lost to us. So he was undoubtedly interested in these ideas. In fact, the idea that the world resembles an intelligent organism made up of whole-part relationships is one idea that Plato and the Stoics held very deeply in common. The only real point of difference is that the Stoics saw the entire universe as being physical, including the logos and intelligence. So they rejected the Platonic idea that there was also a non-physical dimension to reality. But otherwise, their view was the same. Now, the most beautiful writer on the Stoic Cosmopolis is Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus states, to really understand our own nature, we must understand the nature of the world from which we have emerged. And as he writes, without an understanding of the nature of the universe, a man cannot know where he is. Without an understanding of its purpose, he cannot know what he is, nor what the universe itself is. Let either of these discoveries be hidden from him, and he will not be able so much as to give a reason for his own existence. Marcus Aurelius also wrote, always think of the universe as one living organism with a single substance and a single soul, and observe how all things are submitted to the single perceptivity of this one whole. All are moved by its single impulse, and all play their part in the causation of every event that happens. In an organism, all the individual parts exist not to go off in their own direction, but to work for the benefit of the whole. Because we are part of one organism, Marcus writes, we have come into being to work together, like feet, hands, eyelids, or the 2 rows of teeth in our upper and lower jaws. To work against one another is therefore contrary to nature. Seneca, writing about the same thing, uses an even more beautiful image. He writes, the universe that you see, containing the human and the divine, is a unity. We are the limbs of a mighty body. Nature brought us to birth as kin, since it generated us from all the same materials and for all the same purposes, endowing us with affection for one another and making us companionable. Let us hold things in common as we are born for the common good. Our companionship is just like a stone arch, which would collapse without the stone's mutual support to hold it up. As Marcus Aurelius writes in a passage reminiscent of modern ecological thought, all things are interwoven with one another. A sacred bond unites them. There is scarcely one thing that is isolated from one another. Everything is coordinated, everything works together in giving form to the one universe. Because we're woven into the warp and woof of the cosmic tapestry, each person is implicated in ever widening circles and ever larger wholes. So to use modern scientific language, an individual is rooted in human community. Human community is rooted in the greater community of the biosphere. The biosphere is rooted in the living dynamics of the solar system, and the solar system is rooted in the great community of the Milky Way galaxy. For the Stoics, the intelligence of the universe is social, and the world is that supreme city in which all other cities are as households. Marcus writes, "The chief good of a rational being is fellowship with his neighbors, and as a part of the world fabric, we help to create the social sphere. Therefore, our actions should help to complete the life of society." But as Marcus Aurelius points out, we are not merely parts of the whole, but limbs of the universe. If we think of ourselves only as parts, we act only out of bare duty and not out of love from the heart of mankind. And because of its emphasis on the universal fellowship of humanity, Stoicism not only inspired Roman statesmen like Marcus Aurelius, but provided the foundation for the early Christian idea of the brotherhood of humanity. And what we can see from all of this is that, according to the Stoics, we are really born to be ethical because we're parts of humanity and united by kinship and by universal reason, like the parts of an organism. We're designed to serve and benefit the whole or the world community. So in addition to being united by love, kinship, and friendship, we're also united by mind and reason. And all these factors combined are responsible for our philanthropic spirit. And they're responsible for many of the greatest human achievements. So at its very deepest level, human society is based on relatedness. And real philosophy and real ethics, like we find in the Stoics, is a practice of relatedness, because ethics doesn't even make sense unless you're related to other people. Another important point also is that in ancient philosophy, proportion and harmony give birth to beauty in the natural world, and that's why the universe is a cosmos, or a beautiful order. So before we move on, let's summarize the basic elements you need in order to create a cosmos, a cosmopolis, or something that is beautiful. First of all, you will need harmony or concord. But even before you can have harmony, you need something more basic. You need logos, proportion, or relationality or relatedness. And of course, you need whole part relationships. So once you have all three of these things, you're likely to end up with an integrated whole that is beautiful. Now, I'm just going to spend a few minutes showing how you can actually see logos, intelligence, and whole part relationships in living organisms and the patterns of nature. The ancient Stoics would have loved this, and this is very important because it gives you a glimpse of how logos, proportion, and intelligence is present in nature, and exactly how nature's intelligence works, at least in some ways. And you never need to take the idea of logos on faith because you can actually see it. So this diagram here is a representation of the creation of the world soul according to Plato. And essentially for Plato, being has two different aspects to it: sameness and difference, and everything participates in sameness and difference. So, for example, you as an individual participate in sameness through self-identity, yourself, but you also participate in difference because you're different from everyone else. And so what happened is that in this cosmic creation myth based on Pythagorean thought, Sameness and difference are combined together through the ratios of musical harmony, or the principles of harmony and concord, and that gives birth to the world soul. And what I want to show here is how different living organisms and models of patterns in nature combine sameness and difference. So they use proportion to combine sameness and difference. So this idea of logos, or proportion and harmony, isn't something that you simply have to believe in. You can actually see it with your own eyes. And one example of that is this nautilus shell. And you can see that the nautilus shell gives birth to beauty. It's harmonious and beautiful, but it's uniting sameness and difference because it's expanding at the same proportion and the same rate, but as it expands, it gives birth also to difference. And I also have some examples of fractal geometry, which show quite clearly how this exists in nature, even though these are like computer models. But this is a fractal model of a maple leaf. And one of the characteristics of fractal geometry is that it also harmonizes sameness and difference in terms of what's called scaling. So the little part of the leaf is a model of the larger part, and the larger part is a model of the entire leaf. So you have sameness, difference at different levels of scale. And we can see this in real life living organisms like this cauliflower here. So if we look at the cauliflower, each little floret is a model of the branch, and the branch is a model of the entire cauliflower. And isn't that amazing? Again, we can go back to this photograph of the ivy leaf that was outside my back door when I lived in the United States. And you can see the same pattern repeated at different levels of scale. So if you like unfocus your eyes, you can see this pattern on the right. And it's the same kind of, fractal scaling that we see in, these mathematical fractals. This is a mathematical fractal of a fern, and you can see that each little part is a model of the branch, and each branch is a model of the entire fern. This is another example. This is a photograph of Queen Anne's lace. So each little part is a model of the entire whole. So we have all of these part-whole relationships. This is a fractal model of a coral, and you can see the same patterns repeating at different levels of scale, so that the smallest patterns actually are models of the entire coral. This is a fractal model of a tree. If you practice, you can get good at seeing these fractal patterns in real trees. This is a fractal model of a coral, and this is a fractal model of a coral as well, but it just has like more randomness thrown into it, like you would see in the natural world. Finally, we have this, which is called broccoli romanescu, and it exhibits the same patterns at different levels of scale, the same whole part relationships. And this is a merger between broccoli and cauliflower. So I'm just going to observe the beauty of this, but I don't think I'm going to eat it actually. But it's really amazing. It's really amazing that these ideas of sameness and difference are embodied in living things, and we can see them with our eyes. And what Plato meant by the world soul is the intelligent and harmonious principle of proportion that exists at the heart of nature, or the cosmic pattern, which allows nature's living forms to unfold in the most elegant way, because that's really the way that nature exists. And I have a couple more examples here too. One is the human hand, and you look at the finger bones or the phalanges, and actually these are related to one another through a proportional relationship. It's actually the same proportion linking each adjacent finger bone together. And as it turns out, it's not just any proportion. It happens to be something you've probably heard of. It's the phi ratio, or the golden section. And the thing that is unique about the phi ratio, or the golden section, is that it's the one way of dividing a line where the smaller part of the line is equal to the larger part, in the same way that the larger part is equal to the whole. And the reason that we find this in natural phenomena, this mathematical principle, is that it's a way of integrating the part with the whole. And it also allows our hands to open and close in, the most efficient way. So this is a mathematical ratio that we find in living things. And we also find it in plants. If you look down from above, from the sun's eye view, on the leaf distribution on a lot of plants, and if you squint your eyes, you'll see there's sort of like a spinning pentagonal pattern of leaves. And it's highlighted here in this one slide. But this particular angle of leaf distribution is what you get if you take the 360 degrees of a circle and divide it by the golden section, or the phi ratio. And the reason why plants do this is that it allows each leaf to receive as much sunlight as possible. So then it's another case of the part integrating, with the larger whole to benefit, the larger whole. So these aren't just theoretical ideas. These are ideas embodied in living things. Before wrapping up this first part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Cosmopolis and ethics, and I'm also going to talk about humanitas, or the qualities that make us human. Humanitas is an idea that Cicero derived in part from the ideas of the Stoics on the Cosmopolis. And if you'd like to read more about Stoicism in general, you might want to take a look at my book, Breakfast with Seneca, A Stoic Guide to the Art of Living. It's an introduction to the basic ideas of Stoicism, and it also contains a chapter on the idea of the Cosmopolis. One thing that was radical about the idea of the Cosmopolis is that it declared that all human beings are equal, because everyone possesses a divine spark of logos, or rationality, that makes us all human and equal, regardless of race, gender, or social status. We take this idea to be a foundational aspect of human rights today, but it was first stated by the Stoic philosophers. Unfortunately, because most of the Greek Stoic writings have been lost, we don't know exactly how the idea of Cosmopolis evolved over time. Background ideas for the Cosmopolis certainly came from the Pythagoreans and Plato, but our best ideas of Stoic cosmopolitanism, as it is understood today, come from the Roman Stoics, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. But significantly, one of the most interesting and important sources is the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero, who lived between 106 and 43 BC, who did not formally call himself a Stoic, but personally drew on many Stoic ideas and developed them further in a humanistic fashion. Also, Cicero had first-hand contacts and friends who were serious Stoic philosophers in the Roman world, and who were also engaged in enriching ideas from the Stoic tradition. So, the idea of the Cosmopolis as a rational brotherhood of humanity was extremely important for Cicero because in his hands it became a way to develop almost scientific arguments in terms of ethics and political science. And for Cicero, this depended on three basic Stoic principles, which form a logical progression. So the first Stoic principle stated by Cicero is that nature made humans as social beings with common interests and a common law. And this law would be logos or reason, but it could also be related to love and affection as well. The second principle is that we are all parts of one body. And finally, the third principle is that the benefit of each individual and the benefit of all people together should be the same. In other words, we should look for the common good or try to benefit other humans. Now, scholar Jack Wisniewski, who identified this formula from Cicero's writings, also showed how the formula is used in the passage of Seneca about the stone arch, which we looked at earlier in the talk. And we'll now look at that paragraph of Seneca's again, but broken down by these three principles. But first of all, let's look at the entire passage and see if we can spot these elements. So Seneca writes, "This universe that you see, containing the human and the divine, is a unity. We are the limbs of a mighty body. Nature brought us to birth as kin, since it generated us from all the same materials and for the same purposes, endowing us with affection for one another and making us companionable. Nature established fairness and justice. According to nature's dispensation, it is worse to harm than to be harmed. On the basis of nature's command, let our hands be available to help whenever necessary. Let us hold things in common as we are born for the common good. Our companionship is just like an arch, which would collapse without the stone's mutual support to hold it up." And now we can break this single passage down into three different parts, showing how Seneca expresses each one of these three Stoic principles. So first of all, we have the principle that nature made humans as social beings with common interests and a common law. And Seneca expresses that idea in this way. He writes, "Nature brought us to birth as kin, since it generated us from the same materials and for the same purposes, endowing us with affection for one another and making us companionable. Nature established fairness and justice. According to nature's dispensation, it is worse to harm than to be harmed." So we have that. Next, we have the second principle, that we are all parts of one body. And Seneca states this very directly. He writes that this universe that you see, containing the human and the divine, is a unity. We are the limbs of a mighty body, so we're all part of one body. That's a direct hit, and it reminds us also of the passage from Marcus Aurelius too, where Marcus explains that we are not just parts of the universe, but limbs of the universe. And finally, we have the third principle, the benefit of each individual and the benefit of all together should be the same. In other words, we should work for the common good or try to benefit other humans. And Seneca expresses this too. He writes, "On the basis of nature's command, let our hands be available to help whenever necessary. Let us hold things in common as we are born for the common good. Our companionship is just like an arch, which would collapse without the stone's mutual support to hold it up. So obviously, these direct parallels are not due to chance. And while Seneca read Cicero, it's unlikely that Seneca's passage on the stone arch was inspired from reading Cicero alone. These are common ideas, or even philosophical doctrines in later Roman Stoics too. So most likely, Cicero and Seneca both learned of this formula from an earlier Stoic source, which is now lost to us. And that said, in concluding this part of the talk, I would like to share some other quotations from Cicero showing how Cicero drew upon and adapted Stoic ideas to develop his own ethical and political thought. Importantly, Cicero drew on the Stoic idea of the Cosmopolis to develop the Roman virtue of humanitas, which has several meanings and is part of a project I'm working on right now. This one word, humanitas, has multiple meanings, including humanity, kindness, benevolence, civilization, and learning. Ultimately, humanitas has three main meanings. First, it refers to human nature, the qualities that make us uniquely human. Second, it refers to a kind of education, mental refinement, the liberal arts, or humanistic education. And finally, it refers to kindness, benevolence, and love for humanity. Because of our inborn bond with others, Cicero concluded that nature inclines us toward kindness, generosity, and justice. In other words, the Stoic concept of the Cosmopolis invites us to treat others with dignity and respect. And as Cicero famously stated, the chief aim of all human beings should be to make the interest of each individual and of society one and the same. For if each person selfishly claims for himself what should belong to the common good, all human fellowship will be destroyed. For Cicero, human beings are born to help one another. Human beings are born for one another so that we might help and benefit each other. In this regard, we should follow nature as our guide, to contribute to the common good by sharing what benefits everyone through giving and receiving, and thereby strengthen the bonds of human fellowship with our skills, efforts, and talents. One of the meanings of humanitas, in fact, is kindness, benevolence, and love for all humanity. And while the Greek Stoics saw reason as the defining feature of humanity, Cicero and the Latin Stoics, like Seneca, emphasized something more: love, affection, and a natural inclination toward others were just as essential for them. They argued that generosity, service, gratitude, and justice arise from our instinct to care for our fellow human beings. As a fundamental example, Cicero pointed to parental love, writing that nature creates in parents an affection for their children. And from this primary bond, human communities come into being since we're born to be social. We human beings, Cicero wrote, are adapted by nature to form unions, societies, and states. And this ethical vision of reason shaped by kindness would later resonate deeply with the Renaissance humanists who sought to revive humanitas as a guide for both individual and civic life. In the end, humanitas gives us a fuller picture of what it means to be human, one that goes beyond reason alone. After all, we do not love others just because it's logical, nor do most of us practice kindness simply because reason demands it. Love and kindness are expressions of emotional and moral depth. when philosophy embraces these human dimensions, it becomes something greater, something not just rational, but profoundly humane. And here we can see how concord and harmony underlies Stoic ethics, because to have a genuine ethics based on the principles of nature, ethics always needs to be rooted in the harmony and relatedness that inherently exists between human beings. So that is the end of the first part of this talk, and we can now have some discussion.
Thank you so much, David. That was fabulous.
Hopefully it worked in terms of everything technical.
It did. It worked, came
Okay.
through very clearly here in the hall. And
Okay.
yes, just a wonderful series of ideas and very much appreciated. So we have an opportunity for questions and discussion.
Yes, so let's take some questions from YouTube. I know that there are some people who are very qualified to discuss things. It's too bad we can't have them zoom in, actually.
I'm viewing the questions, the chat on YouTube, and I don't see any questions yet, but there is a fellow in the hall here who does have a question, and I have one to follow up
Okay.
his. So go ahead, Maurice. We'll bring the microphone over to Maurice so that you can hear his question.
First of all, thank you for such a lucid talk. And it seems that when it comes to sharing and reciprocity, which we know ancient cultures and indigenous cultures do with nature, but somehow rationality, a certain kind of rationality, broke from love and reciprocity. And it actually got turned into a market system of selfishness. Could you comment on this seeming inversion of the ethics that you're speaking about? And is there a reclamation project outside of philosophy that could help us?
Okay, well, that's a really good question, and my book, Restoring the Soul of the World, I think addresses that a little bit, because we went from this idea of organic, living, interconnected nature to a mechanistic worldview in which there was no life actually in the living, in the world. There was no life in nature. It was all in human beings. And there was no intelligence in nature either. It was all within human beings. And so that created a split between human beings and the world and led to a very utilitarian worldview where we're constantly trying to extract value from the world. And as part of that, I would say that the idea of harmony or harmonia was lost. And it's very interesting to compare the ethical and cosmological worldview of Cicero with Thomas Hobbes, for example, the author of Leviathan. And I have this little chart here. I realized this just at the end of reading a lot of Cicero, which I've been doing recently for a different project. But you can compare their views of human nature. So for Cicero, human beings are naturally social, kind, and cooperative. But for Hobbes, they're naturally selfish, fearful, and competitive. For Cicero, the basis of political life is to have moral and emotional bonds and say humanitas. Whereas for Hobbes, the basis of political life is fear and rational self-preservation. For Cicero, the origin of justice is rooted in nature and reason, where for Hobbes, it's a human convention enforced by power. And for Cicero, the role of the state is to foster virtue and serve the common good, whereas for Hobbes it's to impose order and prevent conflict. And philosophy's aim for Cicero is to deepen human connection and moral insight, whereas for Hobbes it's to justify political authority and social contracts. So essentially, Cicero and Hobbes are exact opposites of one another. And how that came about is a very interesting question. But obviously, one of the differences is that the Stoics and Cicero observed these phenomena in nature, and this gave birth to the idea of natural law. And one of the very famous sayings of Cicero is that because the world is ordered by logos, human laws should be as well. So in an ideal society, if you went to Rome and Athens, they would have the same set of laws. And so that is the beginning of this long history of natural law, which in a sense culminated in human rights, but human rights are actually quite a bit different from natural law in some ways too. So that's a very good question.
There's questions on YouTube.
Yes, yeah. David, if I may raise a question before we go to the chat questions. It's a kind of a fundamental point, I think, because you passed over it rather quickly, but you noted at one point that that's the fundamental difference between Stoic thought and Pythagorean Platonic thought was that the Stoics saw logos as something visible and manifesting in nature, so that this whole dimension of invisible nature was kind of left out of the picture. But then, am I characterizing what you said correctly?
I wouldn't put it exactly that way, but what I would say is that for the Stoics, everything was corporeal.
Okay.
And for example, like Plato, the universe is more like a mirror. So you're seeing the principles behind the universe mirrored in creation, whereas there isn't any division for the Stoics. It's all just one thing. And it led to some very strange conclusions on their part as well. So I tend to actually be more Neoplatonic than Stoic, I think, in that regard.
Well, one of the reasons,
for what it's worth.
Yeah, yes. Well, no, thank you. But so one of the reasons I started with that question was because one of the quotes that you then gave from Marcus Aurelius, who derived his thinking from the Stoics, was that he mentions the soul as being the logos as being the soul of nature, which presumably would be non-material, non-corporeal, and then also this whole idea that of ethics having to do with thought as well, thought being non-corporeal, right? So it seemed like there was this whole sort of, you could call it the invisible dimensions of nature and of human beings, that it was assumed, but then contradicted by the Stoics having this idea that everything's corporeal. So I was wondering, can you help us with that?
Yes. Well, in a sense, the Stoics were anti-Platonists.
Okay.
So
right.
They didn't like the idea of having a separate spiritual realm. And for the Stoics, the soul was something material.
Okay.
And this was, I would say, and I've been thinking a lot about this recently, but I do feel that this was a very, large, departure from the Greek tradition of logos, because most Greek thinkers did not think of logos in material terms. This was a purely Stoic innovation.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. So I'm turning to the questions on chat on our YouTube channel. The first one is from Professor William O. Stevens, saying, thanks for the excellent talk, David. Could you speak a little about the ambivalence the Roman Stoics had about non-human animals? Seneca and Epictetus praise the quasi-virtues of various animals.
Okay, well, I think that incidentally, William Stevens is a Marcus Aurelius expert, and he's an expert on whole part relationships in Marcus Aurelius. So I'm really honored that he came to this presentation, and I thought it would have some interesting points for him. But I think that, you know, there are certain things that we have to like pick and choose about Stoicism, because I think, for example, like the ethical ideas are quite good, but then, you know, obviously they were like 2,000 years, you know, in the past, and we know more about the cosmos than they do. And one of the interesting things too is that they did take a very materialistic view of the entire universe in terms of it being corporeal, and all of the ancient ideas about matter, turned out to be false. And I'm afraid that even modern day, physicists and quantum physicists don't actually understand what matter fully is. They understand how it works in terms of equations, but it's very difficult for us to conceptualize. And so matter is like the big mystery of, the Western tradition that a lot of things have been projected on. But essentially, I think what William is getting at, perhaps, is that the Stoics believed that human beings represented the apex of rationality in nature because we think consciously. And one of the points that I was trying to make in the talk is that all of nature is permeated by rationality, although it's not self-conscious rationality like we have in terms of human beings. And the thing that makes human beings conscious is that when we think about something, we're able to be aware that we're thinking about it as well. So that's like another dimension. I noticed that in all of those illustrations of plants with whole part relationships and scaling and the fractal geometry, that there's a lot of self-reflection going on, a lot of self-reflection going on in those forms of nature, but they're not conscious of it. And so the Stoic view, and this goes back to the very earliest Stoics, is that essentially animals were created for the use of humans. And so people who are animal ethicists today might not go along with that view, and maybe that's what William was getting at there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. He also added that there's a second part of his question that came in a little bit later, and that's why I didn't notice it. Yet they speaking of various animals that reflect quasi-virtues, yet they toe the Stoic line that animals lack logos and so are outside the circle of justice, and so we can use them as we want.
Well, I think that's definitely incorrect, because so the Stoic argument would be that they lack logos in terms of consciousness, in terms of human consciousness. Mm-hmm. But the Stoic view, as I understand it, is that all of nature is permeated by logos in the same way that all of nature is ensouled. So even plants have souls. Soul just means something that's alive. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's possible to say that, there's any living thing in nature that lacks some kind of virtue. Now, whether or not that means we should, eat things in nature is another question, so that would be a totally different question. But I think that all of nature is permeated by some kind of, rationality in terms of the way things develop and, the laws of nature and the laws of planetary motion and things like that. And the Stoics were, and that was actually a view that I think the Platonists held as well, but I think the Stoics, did emphasize that. But, they did differentiate, different kinds of logos. And so in human beings, supposedly, it's the most developed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In terms of being like self-consciousness.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Andy Armitage. How should we manage relationships that may cause less? How should we manage relationships that may cause less concord and harmony in our community from a Stoic perspective?
Well, that's a very difficult question. And I'll just give you an example, which I think Robin Waterfield, who's a translator of ancient Greek works, pointed out to me once. And that is that you can think of like Marcus Aurelius was the, most, perfect embodiment of cosmopolitan thought, but he spent many years of his life defending the borders of, the Roman Empire and, killing people who wanted to violate it. And, he was enforcing, the boundaries of the state and things like that. So, despite the fact that we are all one humanity, and ideally we would want to live in a totally peaceful, condition with other human beings and work on developing our virtues and things like that, there are times when it is necessary to resort to, self-defense. And this was one of the problems they had in the Renaissance, because in the Renaissance, they wanted to redevelop all of these theories of virtue and humanitas and things like that. And it was an incredibly promising moment. But the reason that it fell apart, at least in Italy, is because, after the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, all of these northern countries came and invaded Italy, and the humanists didn't have an army, so it had a somewhat bad effect on the Renaissance in Italy, which then spread throughout Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. There's another question on chat online asking, is St. Paul a Stoic? It seemed like he was.
Yes. Now, I'm not particularly an expert on that, but he was actually aware of Stoic ideas, and he did quote them in some of his letters. So it's been a very long time since I studied St. Paul, and I did actually study early Christian literature, but it's so long ago I can't really remember. But there are definite echoes of Stoic ideas in his writings, I believe. So, the mystical body of Christ is maybe one example.
One example of a Stoic idea, or one example?
Well, the idea that all human beings are connected through the logos. Mm-hmm. So that was a important idea in early Christian mysticism that you find in thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, he was Jewish, but Clement of Alexandria in Oregon, and all of these great early Christian thinkers had this idea of the logos, in the beginning, was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. But they did not conceive of Logos in a material way, the way that the Stoics did. Actually, I just read that one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, did believe that everything was physical, and it turns out that he was influenced by the Stoics.
Oh, so we can blame the
This
Stoics
is
for that.
one of these things that you'll never hear about in school. But
Yeah, thank you. Question in the hall here.
That was a great presentation. I've thought in terms of the harmony and beauty of nature, but your presentation this afternoon took it to a whole new level for me, and I think that's something that will stay with me forever. I was thinking one of the questions I would have would be regarding selection from the Darwinian materialist point of view. Did the Stoics, here's two rabbits, this one runs faster than that one, so the slow one gets eaten. Did the Stoics deal with that concept of selection? This one survives and this one does not.
not exactly, but actually you're bringing up the second part of the talk, which is only 10 minutes, which is about the evolution of the biosphere. So maybe this is time to switch to that. And then if we have any questions from that part, as well as from the first part of the talk, we can include those as well.
That seems like an excellent idea, David. Please go ahead.
Okay, let's see if I can do this here. In this last part of the talk, we'll look at how the Stoic idea of the Cosmopolis connects with a couple of modern scientific ideas about community building in nature and the biosphere. And before we get into the section, I'll briefly mention my book, Restoring the Soul of the World. And it's a history of the idea of living nature and nature's intelligence from ancient Greek philosophy up until the present day. The book also documents the rise of the mechanistic worldview of the scientific revolution, which pictured the universe as a machine or a clockwork mechanism, devoid of any intelligence or life of its own, which is a world that has now broken down, at least officially, if not in practice. And the book also explores how recent discoveries in science have caused the ideas of living nature and nature's intelligence to reemerge in our own time. Now, in terms of our human experience, the world has always looked pretty much the same. But if we go back billions of years, we're looking at an entirely different kind of universe. And what we now know is that the entire universe itself is evolutionary. The Stoics could not have grasped this in the way that we do. So it started off in a very simple state of superheated hydrogen. And over time, as it expanded and cooled, the process of community building began so that more complex kinds of systems and communities emerged, which in turn gave birth to more complex systems. And this is just one way that the universe resembles an organism more than a machine, because organisms evolve while machines are only constructed by humans. We now know that matter itself has a history and that biological evolution on Earth is an outgrowth of cosmic evolution. So in that sense, it forms a continuous process in a self-organizing universe. When life on Earth arose 3.8 billion years ago, it arose at the earliest possible opportunity once the violent environment of the young Earth had stabilized sufficiently. And obviously, for us and all other organisms to get here today, where we are, from that kind of state, some kind of biological evolution needed to take place. But Darwin's theory of natural selection was heavily influenced by the mechanistic worldview itself, because it pictured organisms as objects being acted upon by external forces or the environment. And while this is true, there's no disputing it, Darwin's theory was incomplete because it did not address the creative powers of life itself or the power of self-organizing systems in nature, which in recent years have been seriously explored by a new generation of scientists and biologists. Darwin was correct to say that the environment influences life, but life also influences the environment. This is obvious today from our human activities, but the most stunning example is seen in Gaia theory, which shows how life and the environment developed together as one co-evolutionary system. And as Gaia theory shows, over millions of years, the Earth's living systems were able to remove excess carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere to create planetary-wide conditions that were more favorable for the long-term development of life itself. And as James Lovelock has shown, without life on Earth, the atmosphere would contain 98% carbon dioxide, similar to Venus. And the surface temperature of the Earth would be somewhere between 466 and 644 degrees Fahrenheit. As Lovelock noted, the evolution of the species and the evolution of their environment are tightly coupled together as a single and inseparable process. And for millions of years now, the oxygen has stayed constant in the Earth's atmosphere at 21%. But over 2 billion years ago, there was too much oxygen produced. And there was an oxygen holocaust that killed off most of the living organisms on Earth. So there was like too much of a good thing. And most of those living organisms were single-celled organisms. But as life in the atmosphere continued to evolve together, the reason that oxygen has stayed constant at 21% for millions of years is because of the combined effect and intelligence of the Earth's organisms, plants, animals, oceans, geology, and atmosphere working together through cybernetic feedback loops to create a stable condition, an atmosphere that has benefited the whole. And right now, with oxygen at 21%, if there was just a little less, all of the mammals would die because we're evolved to require 21%. And if it was a little above 21%, that would be very bad for everything as well, because there would be too much oxygen and there would be all of these incredible fires that were being fed by it. So the co-evolutionary relationship between life and the atmosphere is a symbiotic relationship characteristic of all living systems. Biological evolution is as deeply indebted to community and cooperation, ideas favored by the Stoics, as it is to competition. In symbiotic relationships, organisms evolve together in collaboration and depend on one another for their continued existence. In fact, this sounds very much like a cosmopolis. In fact, one symbiotic relationship exists between bees and flowers who emerged together about 100 million years ago and have been closely intertwined ever since. So bees depend on flowers for their food, and flowers depend on bees for their pollination. Without nature's community building process, molecules, organisms, bees, and flowers simply could not exist. As Lynn Margulis has shown, the mitochondria in our single cells used to, in the distant past, be separate organisms before merging together, aeons ago with other kinds of cells. And we can prove this because the mitochondria in our cells have their own unique DNA, which is different from our, main form of DNA. So even our single cells are tiny communities. So these scientific findings about the community building process in nature, symbiosis, coevolution, and the fact that, in one sense, the entire biosphere, including the atmosphere, is a kind of giant self-regulating organism or system of which we're a part, is strongly reminiscent of the Stoic idea of the Cosmopolis, or the world as organism, and a world permeated by living intelligence. So this is the living biological cosmopolis of which we're all a part. And when we take a deep breath of life-giving oxygen created by plants and exhale carbon dioxide to be transformed back into oxygen by the biosphere, we are hardly isolated individuals, but we are participating in the life process of the entire world. So that's the end of part 2, and thank you very much, and we can have some further discussion now.
So basically, that is the idea of Marcus Aurelius, where he's talking about how everything is, interconnected. And when you look at, the evolution of the Earth occurring over literally billions of years, everything affects everything else. There are these feedback loops. It's all done with mirrors, and everything, in a sense, is present in everything else. So the mammals like us that exhale, carbon dioxide, we influence the plants. The plants that turn carbon dioxide into oxygen influence us, and we're all part of this, incredible system of interconnection that is the natural world. And it's amazing that, it's part of our nature. So it's not really surprising that people like Marcus Aurelius could see this, in ancient times. I mean, this is our sense that we have, that we're part of a cosmos, part of a cosmic community. But it is something that we should try to remember, I suppose, and not lose sight of.
Thank you very much, David. That was a great supplement, brief though it was, illustrating how science has been confirming these ideas. And we were also struck while you were during that presentation that it's this idea of what the Buddhists call codependent arising is very correspondential to that Stoic idea and the Platonic Pythagorean idea, as far as we understand it, that everything emerges in unity with and in codependence upon everything else that's emerging. So to isolate any given thing as having a reality in and of itself, an isolated, independent reality, is to be captured by the illusory nature of perception on the physical plane. Mm-hmm. And that's why I go ahead if you want to comment on that.
I do think that the kind of picture, say, that Gaia theory, represents is, it does mirror the idea of, codependent origination, because everything is affecting everything else. That's what Marcus Aurelius said too. He, you can see that idea of codependent origination in one of the quotes where he says, that everything is contributing to the one whole. And one of the notes that I made before the talk, I was just resting a little bit, and I was thinking it is true that we adapt to the environment, but another way of looking at it too is that we actually embody the environment, in our very structure. So, look at our lungs. It embodies the, atmospheric characteristics of Earth. The forms of our body embody the, gravitational pull of this particular planet that we're on. So we are microcosms, in a sense, of, the greater world.
Yes, your presentation brought that out very powerfully. And that whole idea about mitochondria as originally being separate organisms and now being completely incorporated into larger organisms, like our own constitution.
Yeah, I think that was a discovery that Lynn Margulis made. And if I remember correctly, she was a cell biologist, and she was the collaborator with James Lovelock on Gaia theory. And I think it is. I think it is theory because there's so much evidence to support it. It's not just a hypothesis. It's really sort of like the only, reasonable, explanation of how the living organisms on Earth and the atmosphere, co-evolved, and how it was able to hold, the oxygen levels at that level, and also like maintain, the temperature, because all of these things are, naturally, explainable through, feedback loops. When you get enough, things interacting in nature, it like becomes a big thermostat system in a sense, and there are all these cycles going on.
It also reminds us of the Pythagorean idea in regards to emanation, that the cosmos can be seen as a kind of differentiation process of the single being, of the one. So the many is simply the seeming diversity and reflection of the one into many, but it never loses its original unity.
Right. Yeah, that's really a very Neoplatonic idea. That is something that you find in Plotinus. And so Plotinus, he didn't, like the logos, it's sort of similar to the nous in Plotinus, which means intellect or mind. And for Plotinus, the one is the source of the cosmos. And then the nous is a differentiated image of, it's a harmonically differentiated manifestation of the one. And, it gets very metaphysical and things like that. But he does talk a lot about how everything mirrors everything else in the nous. So you have this idea also in Plotinus of like codependent origination, because one of the things that's unique about the Greek philosophers is that they will use the term God and divinity, but none of the ancient philosophers were theists in the sense of, for example, like Christianity. They didn't believe in a God that stood outside of the universe and drew up like a blueprint and, like willed it into being. It's more like codependent, origination, or in the case of Plotinus, like the one overflows and it gives birth to the nous, and the nous is like this new level of, differentiation, and it contains all of the principles and archetypes and forms and beings that are present, in nature. And so as you go down this continuum, you go from like the nous to the world soul to nature. And for Plotinus, like the nous is an image of the one, the world soul is an image of the nous, and nature is an image of the world soul. And you get down to nature, and it seems that you're dealing with all of these things that are, independent of one another, but at a deeper level, they're all connected, in the ways that we've been talking about.
That was a beautiful explanation. And it reminds us of that, the image you showed in your first presentation, where you had the same and the different pouring into a kind of chalice, and with the music of the spheres emerging from that kind of in a symbolic way. Can you talk a little bit about that Pythagorean idea regarding the music of the spheres?
Yes, actually, so that diagram, I was trying to present a simplified version of the myth and the Timaeus. And Plato actually talks about how the world soul is composed out of the ratios of music and sameness and difference. And he's actually talking about musical ratios. And this is a metaphor, obviously, for the harmonic nature of the world. And I had to present it in a very simple way, in this book. So that was, it's a very simple way, but it's faithful to the idea of the original. And actually, I have a chart, let me see if I can share this, of the meanings of harmony, which is actually, it's like very, very, it's much more complex than the Latin word concord. Because if you go back, let me see if I can do this without destroying something on the computer here. Here we go. Okay, let me share this. Okay, are you able to see that now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a Proto-Indo-European root, R, which is the root of harmonia, and it's also the root of all of these other words like order, ratio, proportion, number, arithmos, and harmonia in Greek, and all of these other terms. So I can send this out to people who signed up for the talk as like a handout. They can download it. But that's very interesting. And I've lost my train of thought now. But what I was thinking is that this is something that you might enjoy because I did find this this quotation also in Cicero that links together concord and harmonia in terms of the state. And Cicero, I've been really reading a lot of Cicero recently because he had the most influence on the early Renaissance humanists. The early humanists wanted to revive these civic ideas that he had, and early Renaissance humanism is like Cicero all the way down. But he was familiar with all of these things. His dream of Scipio was about the music of the spheres, and I thought you would like this because he brings concord and harmonia together in one passage, and he says that what the musicians call harmony in song is concord in a state, the strongest and best bond of permanent union in any commonwealth, and such concord can never be brought about without the aid of justice. And there's so many echoes of Plato in there, because like Plato in the Republic, he's trying to define what justice is. And when he tries to explain what justice is, he turns to the ratios of the musical scale, and just as this part is to this part is this part in the musical scale, that's what justice is in society as well. So all of these things like really, interlink, and we can even see these, proportional relationships in nature. So it's just not an idea, it's something that actually underlies the deep structure of the world that, we experience. It's even part of our human bodies, like in terms of the ratios of our fingers. So it's too bad that students today in school, aren't, exposed to these kinds of ideas, which are, extremely, they're empirical ideas, and it would be a different way of approaching education. So they could learn about, the patterns that connect things together, that are scientifically real. I think that would, because the problem, one of the problems that we have is over-specialization in the educational world. And a lot of the problems that we're facing are these huge problems on a systemic scale. And the way the PhD system is set up is that you're supposed to make an original contribution to human knowledge. And the way that most people do that is by finding something ever smaller to specialize in that no one has specialized in before. And the problem with that is that you end up with people, doing this PhD work that's totally unrelated to everything else. Whereas we live in a world that is characterized by, relatedness, which is something that's not emphasized, obviously, by the educational system. So if we have these huge systemic problems and people can't think of, like larger systems, but only these incredibly specialized, ideas that don't relate to anything else, it doesn't seem very promising in terms of, being able to solve, these problems that we face.
Thank you so much. Yes, we have another question in the hall here.
Yes. In teaching, what have you found ignites the imagination of materialists, so to speak, to come to appreciate living ideas, or we could say the logos and the cosmos?
I'm not sure, but if you liked the talk, then that would be the answer, I suppose. So, because, so right now I teach courses on the Renaissance, and a lot of these ideas were revived in the Renaissance, and they were trying to revive, the philosophy and culture of, the ancient world. And so one of the classes that I teach, like one day, there's a 2-hour lecture on harmony and proportion in Renaissance art, because they were aware of these different mathematical principles. And like, people in earlier civilizations, this is a long tradition, they used these ratios in terms of composing, paintings and architecture. And I've spent many years studying that. And the reason they did it is that they believed that the world is a harmony, and that harmony gives rise to beauty, and that by composing paintings and architecture, by using these ratios, they would be replicating the harmony of nature and creating beauty in their artworks. And if I may be allowed to engage in just a brief moment of self-promotion here, I am teaching a 5-day course in Florence, Italy in March. And if you're interested in learning about that, you could Google the Renaissance program in Florence or Living Ideas Journal, and it will take you, you'll be able to find, information on the course. And so what we do is we try to look at how the ideas that inspired the Renaissance, and we try to extend it also to what could we learn from those ideas today, because there were a lot of very valuable ideas. For example, like the idea that like self-development should also involve making a contribution to civic life, which is exactly the Stoic idea. In fact, there was a huge influence of, Stoicism in the early Renaissance, like Seneca and Cicero. And they were trying to revive these ideas because they felt that they lived in such a bad time that they had to go back to these earlier ideas to do kind of a cultural reset.
Is that a course?
So,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead. Finish. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Because what happened is in the 1300s, Francesco Petrarch, it was a very, very bad time. And, he had a whole list of, he was a classical scholar, and he had a whole list of ways that his time was like much worse, he imagined, than classical times. And he invented the idea of the Dark Ages, which he felt that he was living in. And so he started and inspired this search for lost knowledge, which included like the lost architectural principles of Rome. So they would go back and measure, the Roman ruins. There was really only one surviving, building totally intact in Rome, which was the Pantheon, because it was made into a church. And so Brunelleschi introduced the Roman style into the Renaissance, and they wanted to recover all the lost philosophy and literature of the ancient world. And in a sense, they wanted to recreate the ancient library that had inspired people like Marcus Aurelius, because the political leadership was so bad in the time. There were constant wars and tyrants, and Italy was not a unified state. The different parts were constantly at war. And they felt that the only way that they could solve the problems they were facing was to do a kind of cultural reset and look at, the types of things that were working in the past. And, basically, they wanted to revive these ideas of, Cicero and produce, virtuous leaders. And at the same time, they wanted to create a renewed society that would be lively and vibrant and beautiful, that would inspire the creation of more virtuous people. So it was like this spiral process. They wanted to create like more virtuous individuals, but they wanted to create an environment that would also inspire the creation of people like that. And that essentially is how the Renaissance came into being. And it took like a few decades, but given time, these ideas spread among the Renaissance humanists. And it was, in many ways, a very successful movement. They totally transformed their society, and they brought back, classical art, and they created the first public library in all of Europe, and they discovered all the ancient classical texts. So it was really an amazing, period, and it did take some time, but they were very successful, in accomplishing, what was, a very grandiose idea of restoring the values of the classical world. It wasn't like flipping a switch and having it happen overnight, but there were like several generations of people involved that they actually did achieve that goal. So maybe that can give us hope today, because when I tell people about the history of all of this, there are a lot of people today who feel that we probably could have ethical, more ethical leaders. And so, sometimes when you look at what's happening in the world, it does feel like we are living in, something of a dark age, and that we have lost, the fundamental principles that, makes us, human beings. And that if somehow we could, revive those ideas in some way, it could make a meaningful contribution to society. And their main approach was based on education. So they were obsessed with, the ideas of education and human potential and things like that. And they felt that education was a force that could really change the world.
Well, it's remarkable, David. Thank you for that extended answer, because so much of your expertise is very much in alignment with the aims of the Institute. So we're going to have you come back repeatedly and share with us some of this history and this whole idea that of classical antiquity and the Renaissance as holding some of the keys that would help us solve the issues that we're dealing with today is really at the heart of part of what the Institute is trying to do. So that was a wonderful answer. There's another very interesting question that came up in the chat, which is on a kind of a different tact, but the question was, how do fractals appear in language?
In language? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. The reason I started studying fractals is I was working on my PhD, and I was, interested in Neoplatonism, and I gave a paper on how fractals relate to the ideas of Plotinus, like in the news, because it's like it's all done with mirrors. I know in the talk that you gave, you used the Indra's net, the net that has a mirror at every intersection point. And that's what the nous of Plotinus is like. And the thing about fractals is they're generated through these circular equations. So this idea of like feedback loops, keeps coming up again and again. And that's why you get these patterns that reflect the same order at different levels of scale, because everything is folded back on itself. And for Plotinus, mind or consciousness was something folded back on itself. It's like a circuit. There's a famous diagram by the physicist John Wheeler of like a universe, and then the eyeball is looking back at the beginning of the U, and he's saying that like consciousness is a self-excited circuit. It's like we're the universe, contemplating itself. So, but how it relates to language, how fractals relate to language, I'm not exactly sure. So if someone has some ideas about that, I would be interested in hearing them. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some connection, but I can't imagine on my own what it would be, so I need someone smarter to point it out to me.
Well, the idea you mentioned earlier about the verbum or the word being that which was uttered in the beginning, so that you could say the first formation of language on a metaphysical scale being connected with that idea of the logos, and that it differentiates. So probably, yeah, you're right that someone with a deep mystical insight. In fact, that reminds me of the story that's told in the Bible, where the disciples of Jesus were able to speak in tongues, so that no matter what language the listener spoke, they could understand what was being said. So that it seems like that is part of the spiritual and mystical quest. There's at a certain point, perhaps, there's a capacity to see that universality in language, and to speak in a way that makes one understood by other beings, and that would include animal kingdom and so on. Perhaps there's just some thoughts there. Right.
And there is the phenomenon of musical harmony as well, which I've studied in depth from the Pythagorean perspective, because music, which actually was musical tuning systems, was one of the 4 branches of ancient mathematics. And what happens is when you pluck a single string, it vibrates as a whole, then it vibrates as 2 parts and 3 parts and 4 parts and 5 parts, going on to infinity. And each one of those smaller parts is giving off a higher overtone. So I have, instruments to demonstrate this, like a polychord, which is it's like a monochord, but like 15 strings. And this is described in ancient Greek musical writings. And so you can listen to, you can pluck these strings and they're all tuned to the same level, but you can hear the overtones. So whenever you pluck a string, you're actually creating a chord. And you can play it out on the piano as well, this harmonic overtone series. But what that goes to show is that the principles of harmony are innate within the structure of the universe. And then you go to different cultures, and different cultures have like different musical syntaxes and, you know, different forms of music, but underlying, you know, all of the music on earth is the same harmonic, you know, overtone series. So wherever you go, you're going to find that the music is influenced by that same harmonic structure, because it's just built into the vibrations, you know, given off by a vibrating string and other instruments.
That's a wonderful addition to the response. Thank you so much. So I'm going to, unfortunately, our time is nearly up. So we have a tradition here at the Institute where one of our members offers a vote of thanks for our speaker, and Robert Moore will be doing that for us today.
Yeah. Hi, David. One of the things that remarkable to me from the first time I contacted your video and found how you were expressing ideas is bringing back beauty to the world. That beauty is a central idea and very close to the human heart. And as you explained today, that each of us has a spark of rationality, which is our participation in the Logos. And we have the capacity to see ratio and to implement ratio in our lives. That everyone has that capacity, and it links us as a single community. Whether you're a Stoic or not, you can look upon that spark of rationality as a link. And you showed us how that link also links us to the operation of the whole part, or ratio. Ratio is basically something that links parts together. And ratio links the same and the different. You know, it makes things, it links them constantly together to form this indissoluble unity between however small or however great. They are linked by these elements of ratio, or what we call the laws of the universe. So you gave us all, as well as all those beautiful pictures that I always love, you know, where you see ratio, and especially a golden ratio, unfolding in the leaves, in the cauliflower, in the coral, as well as I had forgotten about the ratio of our bones in our hands, our phalanges, and how this works to produce very efficient elements in the life system. So, I mean, there's a lot one could say, but main thing is, I would say, is beautiful. Thank you for bringing beauty back to us.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it. And I'm just following in the footsteps of the Renaissance thinkers, because they wanted to infuse the world with beauty, because they thought that living in a beautiful environment elevates the human spirit, and and has a very profound effect on us in the same way that really ugly environments have a profoundly negative effect on us. So this is something that is within our control as a culture, and so characteristic of the Renaissance. And I think that all of those things combined and creating a more beautiful world is something that is essential for human happiness.
Yeah, and it is interesting how that one thing that's common to Pythagoras, Plato, the Neoplatonics, and the Stoics is beauty is a central idea in all of them.
Yes, and it's very strange too, or very interesting because, philosophers disagree on a lot of things. And all of the ancient philosophers agreed on the definition of beauty, that it involved whole part relationships and, good proportion and things like that. And so that's very stunning. And another aspect of that too is that people believed in the objective existence of beauty in nature, for well over 2,000 years, and they only started questioning the objectivity of nature's beauty in the 1700s. So this idea that beauty is somehow subjective or only in the eye of the beholder is a very, very recent idea in human history. And there is some truth to it, because there is different people have different tastes, but that doesn't affect, for example, the beauty of the geometry of the snowflake. Anyone can look at that, or, the beauty of flowers and things like that. Those are things that we innately, respond to because they embody this harmony that exists in nature.
Yeah, and it's almost universally recognized, even by people that we would not admire. They can recognize it. But I like Plotinus. He said that to any vision must be brought an eye fitted to what is seen and having some likeness to it. So that's the way where, beauty of the eye and the beholder kind of comes in. But before we end, I want to make sure we alert people to our next event, which will be on July 5th. It's a founding day for the Institute of World Culture, which was founded July 4th, 1976. The founding day lecture will be The Unanswered Question, Charles Ives, who was a great American composer, very revolutionary, and he kind of embodies this idea that to any vision must be brought in this case, an ear fitted to what is to be heard, because he really challenged the listener in remarkable ways. So I hope anybody can come. That will be from 2 to 4, July 5th here in Concord Hall. It'll also be live streamed.
Thank you again, David, so much. We really appreciate all the effort you put into this today and your brilliant responses to questions. So another round of applause for David, please.
Great, well, thank you very much. It was wonderful speaking with you.
So we're going to say goodbye, David.
That was really fine.
Recording stopped.